Good morning. Anybody there? Oh, yep. Precepts incense, samadhi incense, wisdom incense, liberation incense, cloud of lighted incense, pouring into the dharma realms, offering to the highest teachers of the 10 directions. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to all directions of space, all realms, past, present, and future, all Buddhas, the honored Dharma, the enlightened Sangha, the permanent three treasures. I respectfully bow to our own teacher, the Dharma master of the samsara world, Sakyamuni Buddha, the future-born Maitreya Buddha, great wisdom mentor Sri Bodhisattva, great practice Samattabhadra Bodhisattva, Dharma protector Bodhisattvas, Buddhas and Bodhisattvas assembled at the great holy mountain. I respectfully bow to the great love, great compassion, Amitabha Buddha of the Western Paradise, great compassion, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, great vow, Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva, great power, Mahastavaprala Bodhisattva, all the Bodhisattvas in the great pure ocean. So I hope everyone is doing well. Hello and good morning yourself. The light coming in that window behind me is bright, but maybe it won't be too bad. Anyway, as I'm sure you know, Halloween is later this week. There's a link that I posted right at the beginning of the chat, which you can, if you haven't already watched, you can watch later. It relates to the topic. It's very short, it's just a couple minutes long. But I started thinking about possible topics, and I remembered this thing that I'd seen a long time ago, which is what the link has to do with. There's this Twilight Zone episode, and it's called The Masks. It's set in New Orleans during Mardi Gras, but everybody's wearing masks as if it were Halloween, which is why I thought about it now. And this elderly man has invited his family to come spend the evening with him. He knows he's soon to pass away, and so he wants his family to spend one last evening with him. And so when they show up, he makes them wear these hideous masks, basically like Mardi Gras masks, but very, very unpleasant looking. And he tells them that they have to wear them all evening, or he's going to cut them out of his will. And so then at the end, after midnight, he lets them remove the masks, and their faces now reveal their true nature. It's really creepy, so I hope you'll watch it. It illustrates a little bit about the fluid and fickle nature of this thing we call self, which is what it has to do with Buddhism. So there's a practice in some Buddhist traditions where you meditate on the question, who am I? So think about that. If I asked you, do you know who you are? You'd say, well, of course I do. But then when you start asking yourself that question and digging a little deeper for answers, it turns out not to be that simple. So maybe you're a Buddhist, like I am. Or maybe you identify some other religion and you're interested in Buddhism. That's fine. Maybe you're a mother or father, but you're also someone else's child. Maybe you see yourself as one way, others see you as another way. You might see yourself as an angel, but now and then you catch yourself looking kind of devilish. So who are you really? What is your true self? And how do you know? So for centuries, millennia really, there's been this ongoing dialogue about the self and whether or not such a thing even exists. And we don't think about it a lot of the time. And even when we do, the idea of debating the existence of a self might seem to not have very much to do with our day-to-day lives. The most recent debate about that, though, comes from psychology, psychotherapy. People who are looking at the nature of the self and its role in neuroses and things like that. So, um, we don't think about it much, but then maybe all of a sudden you take a little hit to your self-esteem, and we feel bad about ourselves when that happens. Or you might go to a costume party and experience some pleasure from being able to drop yourself for a moment and be somebody different. Um, Actors that I've known really like being able to walk around in somebody else's self for a while. It was a big relief. And so we realized that maybe this question about self is a little bit more relevant to day-to-day life than it appears on the surface. So this debate about the nature of the self was going on in India during the Buddha's time, so 2,500 years ago or more at least. And the Buddha was asked many times by different people, what is your view? Is there a self, an Atman? That's the Sanskrit term for self, Atman. Or is there not one? And the Buddha would often just refuse to get caught up in the question. There's a story about the Buddha and an ascetic they called Vacchagoda, the wanderer. And he was one of these guys who's always got a bunch of questions. There's nothing wrong with asking questions. Some of you like to ask questions. I like to answer them. There's a problem, though, with asking questions as a way to distract yourself from your practice, and getting caught up in analysis of stuff rather than actually doing the work. And so the Buddha, and he was one of those guys. He knew what he needed to do, but he'd a lot rather think about it than actually do anything about it. So anyway, he went to the Buddha and he asked Venerable Gotama, is there a self? And so the Buddha didn't answer. He just sat there quietly. And Vacchagoda says, well, then, is there no self? And again, the Buddha was silent. And so Vacchagoda got up and left. Now, probably if he'd asked a third time, the Buddha would have answered his question. That's a thing you see in these discourses a lot. You got to ask three times. In fact, in some Buddhist traditions now, before someone like me will give a dharma talk, you have to ask them for it three times, which is usually a very formal sort of ritualized thing. But anyway, the Buddha's cousin Ananda was there. And Ananda said, hey, why didn't you answer his question? And the Buddha said, well, if I were to answer that there is a self, then that would be conforming with the view that there is an eternal soul, which the Buddha didn't teach. We don't teach that in Buddhism. And if I were to answer that there is no self, then the bewildered Vacchagoda would become even more bewildered and wonder, then what about the self I used to have? Does it not now exist? Because, well, we're all here this morning with some sense of who we are. And so when we think this self that I think I have, isn't real, well, then what happened to that who we are that we had when we logged on to YouTube this morning, right? So he basically didn't want to just get caught up in a lot more analysis about it with this fellow. But the Buddha's second major sermon, after he set forth the middle way, explained that identifying with what we mistakenly think of as a self is often the cause of stress. And much of Buddhist practice is designed to help us really, you could say, let go of our masks and reveal our true face. Like there's a Zen koan that just show me the face you had before your parents were born. Well, what does that mean? What is my true self? What is my true face? In the Buddhist view, we're a collection of processes that are all constantly changing. And so there's this flow of elements that come and go in the physical body. And there's a flow of feelings, perceptions, and responses the flow of consciousness that experiences all of these things. And so our sense of self arises out of identification with these patterns that appear in the context of this flow. But these patterns are very ephemeral and they're not tangible. They're not. They're not. They're not inert in some way. They are constantly changing and morphing, and what we're seeing is a snapshot of a wave, not a wave, right? So there's a Japanese poem that reads very simply: showing front, showing back, maple leaves fall. So what does this have to do with the self? Well, there's this idea that a maple leaf falls without any regard for what might be a good side or a bad side. So when we start asking this question, who am I? We often discover that we've built up an identity around these patterns that don't have any more substance or endurance than the idea of front or back has to a maple leaf that's falling. And yet we grasp onto these identities and cling to them based on this illusion. And we create a lot of difficulties for ourselves when we do that. When we look a little deeper, we see that we can discard some of the answers that are not only illusory, but stressful. So we might see that we have qualities that we've neglected or ignored, but that with some polishing can be useful. So talking about what the self is does not negate the importance of having a good self-concept or good character in yourself. Buddhism encourages the cultivation of strong character. We're urged to cultivate skills like kindness, mindfulness, perseverance, compassion. And we recognize these qualities, though, as means to awaken. They're not badges to be worn as attachments to our ego. They're not something to identify with. They're things to do that really develop how skillful the patterns are of our lives. So the essence of spiritual practice then can be to awaken our true self, which means to live an authentic life. Gyomay Kabose once wrote an essay along those lines and compared our view of self to a gardening. He said, some people are like, they keep the front yard clean and nice, but there's a big pile of mess out back where nobody will see it. And that's kind of the way a lot of us do. A truly authentic person doesn't have a front and back. If you're living an authentic life, you can play in your whole yard, right? By the way, don't come over and look at my backyard. No, I'm kidding. It doesn't look any worse than the front yard does. That's not saying much. Anyway, if we're able to lead our lives as maple leaves fall, free from secrets and pretense, then there's not any need to cling to this idea of front or back. We can let go of prejudices and preconditions and that we have used to obscure our experience and live more fully. So think about things like the 3 tenets of Zen Peacemakers. The first one is to not know. And in other words, to let go of these experiences and prejudices and preconditions that we use really to insulate ourselves from our perceptions, but also to insulate ourselves from our true authentic self, insulate ourselves from ourself. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? But you know where I'm getting at. So there's this word in Buddhism, suchness, that's useful here. It simply means things as they are, life as it is, truth, just truth. It's reality without artificiality, without makeup. So applied to ourself, it would be the face that we have before our parents were born. It's our face without a mask. The face we wore before we adapted a lot of should-bes and wannabes and must-bes to it and simply lived the way things are. This doesn't mean, giving in or being defeated or anything like that. It means recognizing life as it is. And then we can know that there's no front and no back. And we can be honest with ourselves. Nothing to hide from, and we can be sincere. And so we can live authentically, which is to live better. So how do we do this? And the Buddha talked about several processes for living more authentic lives. And first, we can cultivate characteristics that help us do this, things like kindness and compassion. And take the time to be grateful for what we have and be glad that we have this opportunity to live as human beings with the ability to think about things like this. So these are, kindness is something that emerges from our natural state. That might be a little shocking because a lot of times people think that, kindness, generosity, those kinds of things are not authentic. But we're thinking that because we've clouded our true nature from ourselves with a bunch of clinging and grasping and greed and hatred and delusion and things like that, which are based on misconceptions. So if you're based on reality, the natural state is to be kindness and compassionate and have gratitude and things like that. It's not obvious, but when you work with it, you start to experience that. Kindness is based on the reality that I want to be well and happy. And if it's good for me, it's got to be good for other people. Hatred is based on the idea that I want to be well and happy. And if somebody else is well and happy, then that hurts me in some way, which is bull. It doesn't. In fact, if I live in a world where people are well and happy, I'm living in a world where it's easier to be well and happy, aren't I? Right? So, well, it's something that arises naturally. It's not a protector, and I guess the idea that you can use yourself as a protection is kind of based on an illusion too. I mean, how can you protect yourself? Yourself is not something that you had to do something to get, right? You can do certain things to make life easier for yourself, make life better for yourself, make yourself healthier so you're likely to live longer. But you didn't get to decide when you got here. You don't get to decide when you leave, right? You don't get to decide how tall you are or anything like that. I know people who have, chronic medical conditions that they would decide otherwise if they could. But we don't need to define ourselves with that. And so it's actually when we start to define ourselves that we start to make ourselves, that we start to put ourselves in danger, right? When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, to be open, to be in a position of not knowing, to be in a position of seeing truth, seeing reality as it is, we're actually making ourselves healthier and more resilient. If we put up walls around ourselves to protect ourselves, we end up like one of these people who gets up at 3 o'clock in the morning to tweet about how unfair everybody is to him, right? Because you start to think that, that you create this sense of self that is illusory, always illusory. Any sense of self is illusory, right? And so once you start defining it as the greatest self that ever was, well, then you're going to get constant hits to that because you're not, right? So live your life and don't worry about whether you're the best self ever or somebody else's self is better than yours or whatever, because I'm totally digressing here. I just put down my notes because I want to answer your question. Yes, letting go in order to experience what is. Everything is unknown, really. We have this illusion that we can know something. We have this illusion that if I plan, tomorrow is going to be what I planned it to be. And how often does that work out? That's not to say don't plan. If we eat right and we get enough physical activity and all of that, we're likelier to live longer than if we eat 3 cheeseburgers a day and sit on the couch and watch TV all the time, right? We know that, but we can't say, okay, well, I'm going to eat right and live healthy and live to be 110. We don't get to decide that, right? So we don't know how long we're going to live. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know what our circumstances are going to be. And so that's a good starting point. I don't know who I'm going to be tomorrow, but let me develop the skills that I need in order to be able to live authentically tomorrow, right? And if I do that, then I don't have to worry about who I'm going to be tomorrow because I'll have what I need in order to do the best I can with what I have. I hope that makes some sense. Anyway, I'll go into that a little bit more. So the Buddha talked about some processes we can use for living authentically and cultivating kindness and compassion and things like that are those processes. So since we're not a fixed self, stuck with a preordained destiny, and I was talking about that during the last couple of Sundays at White Sands, that we can feel like we're destined to something. And in fact, even our habits and our past karma can, to a large extent, kind of determine what our lives are going to be like. But if we let go of those patterns and processes, those habits, then we're not stuck with that. And then we can embrace really our truer nature. And that requires us to see clearly what we're doing. And so very often we start to mistake our mask for our true face. And we need to be able to look behind the mask that we use to hide ourselves from ourselves. Right. So in that episode of Twilight Zone, I was talking about the dying man wants his family to stop hiding behind their masks and see themselves as he sees them. And so he wants them to have to look behind the pretense that they were somehow good people and have to look at their own selfishness and their greed and their hatred, which, again, the three poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion. And one of the delusions is the delusion that we have some sort of a self. So that can seem negative, but it's really part of what we do in order to move in a positive direction spiritually. We have to be able to see those things before we can work to loosen their grip on our lives. Think about some of the scandals that you've seen in your life and some of the deep problems in our society. What is the root? And the root is often a character issue. People who live in duplicity tend to create problems for themselves and for others because they're putting on this face, and what's behind the face is corrupt. And sometimes this happens in a big splashy way. All those people, exposed in the Borat movie, for example, that's a pretty dramatic example of that sort of seeing behind the mask thing. But it also happens in much smaller, some more subtler ways to people like us who are not famous. And even without the notoriety, people still suffer. So the solution to a lot of our problems as a society would be to live better. We need to value character more and things like money and fame less. That doesn't mean you can't make money or be prosperous and you don't have to give everything away and go live in the woods. That's not productive either, but it's a matter of where you put your emphasis. So a friend of mine talked about this in terms of management. He said that businesses tend to hire based on skill sets. You've got the education, you've got the experience, you've got the, demonstrate the skills, capacities, credentials, whatever. And when they fire people, they tend to fire based on character, right? So you got the resume, but you don't have the heart to back it up, right? And so he was talking to people that he would consult with about the need for management to kind of develop character. And basically, he would talk about it in a way that sort of equates to this. We have three faces. There's the mask that we show to others, the face that we think everyone is seeing, and we can call that our self-image. This is what we think we show the world. And then there's our reputation, which is the mask others actually see. It's like the mask they put on your face. That's their image of us, which is also not our true character. Maybe closer. It kind of depends on how you're living, but it's not necessarily the truth. The truth, the real character, is what happens when nobody else is looking, right? You see that meme, dance as if no one is watching. Well, live as if no one is watching, right? And then and then when people are watching, what they're seeing is the real you, and you're seeing the real you. You're seeing your capacity, your potential. So integrity is what happens when all of those things are aligned. What you think you're showing, what others are seeing, and what's really in your heart, what's going on when nobody's watching. So to do that, one of the things we have to do is examine our limitations. We all have limitations. We can't be something that we're not. A rose can't decide one day to be a tulip, and it doesn't need to. A rose is perfectly good as a rose. A tulip's perfectly good as a tulip, right? So part of our job on earth is to accept what we are. When we can't do that, then that's a problem. We start to feel let down. But another part of our job is to not put limitations on ourselves that don't really exist. When we start to imagine that we have them and we really don't, when we underestimate our own capacities, we let ourselves down. One of the things that attracted me to Buddhism was that the Buddha was a human being, not a deity. And he did things that people like us could do, and he went on to achieve enlightenment, which is something we could do. So if we work at it like he did, we make spiritual progress too. But a lot of us think that we don't have that capacity. I had another friend, interesting guy. I'll give a Dharma talk about him one of these days. I haven't been in touch with him for a long time, but I met him while I was a features writer for the News Journal. And he had been named Superman of the Century by a powerlifting magazine because he had set more records for Olympic lifting and powerlifting than anybody else in the last 100 years. So, because he'd done different things at different weight classes and all of that. So he racked up a bunch of records. And so I interviewed him and I worked with him a bit and wrote about him. And he was telling me that twice or maybe three times the doctors had told him that he was not going to be able to lift weights again. And one of the times when he was pretty young and he badly damaged a knee, I think it was, when he was lifting weights and getting ready for the Olympics. He ended up not going to the Olympics. And then another one was when he was hit by a car and really, really badly injured, lots and lots of bones broken and stuff. And then he had some illness. I can't remember what the illness was. But all three times, doctors said, man, you got to give up the weightlifting. You can't do it. And then he would work his way back and he would go on and set more records all three times. And he would talk, he was doing some personal training and he would say, you get these guys who come in here and they think they can't do anything. He said, but the reality is we all give up on our bodies a lot sooner than our bodies give up on us, which is a really interesting way of thinking about that. We tend to give up, we tend to think we can do less than we actually are capable of if we put some effort into it. So anyway, back to Buddhism. In Southeast Asia, Buddhist temples are referred to as a wat, W-A-T. And the word wat doesn't mean temple. It actually refers to a measuring stick. And so a temple is a place that you go to see how you and your practice are measuring up against the ideal represented by awakening, by Buddhahood. So I think that's an interesting way of looking at our practice and looking at the temple you go to. Imagine next time you go to White Sands or whatever, this is where you're going. You look at the Buddha statue and you're going, okay, I want to measure myself. How am I doing compared to that, right? Backing up against the wall like when you're a little kid and making marks at the top of your head to see how you're growing. How am I growing spiritually? How high have I developed the skills that I need to achieve what I want to achieve? There's a Japanese story. I'll tell you one more story and then that'll be it. There's a Japanese story about this man whose son was critical of him for going to the temple so often. And this man was very devout. And his son, who had studied all about science at the university and stuff, thought really religion was a waste of time. And so he started pressuring his father, stop going to the temple. Don't waste your effort on something so pointless. Definitely don't make donations. I mean, just throwing money away and so on. So finally, his father got tired of hearing him. And he said, all right, tell you what, I'll stop going to the temple on one condition, but I need you to promise two things. First, for the next 2 weeks, I want you to write in a diary everything you do, everything you say, every thought you have. And at the end of 2 weeks, show me the diary. And if you can write about all those things completely honestly and sincerely for 2 weeks, that's the one thing. And the second thing, if you can let me read the diary, then I'll stop going to the temple. So the son said, well, that's the deal. He thought this would be a no-brainer. This would be easy. And so he agreed that he would do what was asked. And he began to faithfully keep this diary, honestly and sincerely and completely putting down everything that he did and everything, all the conversations that he had, things he said, things that he thought about and stuff. And halfway through the 2 weeks, by the end of the first week, he was looking over what he had written and he realized there's no way he could show that to anyone. And when he saw his private thoughts and words and deeds written out in front of him like that, he realized he wasn't nearly as good a person as he thought he was. And so he went to his father and he said, man, I can't do this anymore. He said, so many of these things that I wrote down, I'm ashamed of. I thought I was good and that I was doing fine, but when I was frankly honest with myself, I couldn't show that to you or anyone else. And his father said, I understand. We all think we're better than we are. So, but when we strip ourselves down and we look at our own ego, we realize that we're selfish. And then we do a lot of things that we don't want other people to know about. He said, this is why I go to the temple, not to show religiousness or to listen to sermons, but really to look into myself. We find it so easy to blame and criticize others. But when we inspect ourselves, we see that we're not so good. We're not angels. And with that kind of introspection comes understanding. He says, I can forgive others' shortcomings and get the true inner peace that comes only from seeing myself clearly. That's a very interesting way of looking at this. You know, people come say, you know, we have a meetup group and people will sign up and, you know, we ask the question mostly to find out if they're real people or if they're just bots joining groups so they can spam people. And we say, you know, what are you looking for? And inner peace is one of the ones that comes up very often. I'm looking for inner peace. Well, where do you find inner peace? Can't look out there for inner peace. It ain't out there. It's in here, right? And where does it come from? It comes from seeing ourselves clearly, which means really seeing behind this idea of self, identity, seeing really what we do, these processes that go on in our mind and in our bodies. So anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about today. You have any questions? So while you're thinking about any questions you might have, I will mention something that came up Thursday in the Zoom meeting. A couple of people, I guess, were reading my workbook, Loving Heart, Peaceful Mind. I think that's what's called, Loving Heart. Yeah, that's it. Sorry, it's been a long time. And they were wanting to know if we could do some kind of a workshop or something to work through that. So let me explain this book. Don't run off and buy it. I created that. I was doing some retreats. I wanted to do some retreats on developing the Brahma Viharas, you know, meditating on metta, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And so I had created some supportive material and some exercises and things like that. And so we did one of the retreats and it went fine. And I added a little bit to the material and I was planning another retreat. And so rather than printing a bunch of copies of this and, binding them or sticking them in report covers or whatever. I realized it would be just about as cheap and way easier to just publish it as a book on, the Amazon self-publishing platform. And so I did that, and so that's why it's out there. And it was several years ago, and I've done multiple other retreats since then. I've worked with it several times, retreats and workshops and stuff. And and after this came up Thursday, I started thinking about it. I really wanted to redo that book. And a good thing to do would be to do a couple of workshops with it, so I could come up, make a bunch of notes about what I want to change, and redo that book. So it's a little bit more, accessible to people who just want to get the book and read it. So watch for an announcement for one of those. The people who asked for it, I've asked them to talk to me, think about when to do it, and we'll schedule it based on that. But I'll make it known publicly. So we'll figure out when to do that, and we'll do it on Zoom or some similar platform. So anyway, just watch for that, and I will be back. Good. You get our emails, I presume. If not, email. I'm sure you do. If not, you can message me on Facebook, and I'll make sure you get the information. The other thing is, somebody emailed me and said that they had gone to our website for something and that they got an error message. They weren't able to get on it. So I went to the website and I got the same error message. And so I said, uh-oh. So I logged into the dashboard and I couldn't get into the dashboard either. So our website is down. I'm hoping that that's a temporary condition. I'm hoping that it doesn't mean I'm going to have to rebuild the whole website, which I could do, but I don't want to. Might be a blessing in disguise. There's a lot of really old stuff on there. But anyway, I started to say, go sign up for our email notices, but you can't do that right now. So anyway, I'll be in touch with you about that. So if there's nothing else, we will do the final dedication, which I left over there. Buddha nature pervades the whole universe, existing right here now, and offering flowers, candles, and incense, hearing the Dharma and training the mind, great merit is attained. We dedicate this merit to the great Master Shakyamuni Buddha, the all-pervading and everlasting three treasures, the 16 guardians and all protectors of the Dharma and their relations throughout space and time, to all ancestors of the Sangha and all beings in the Dharma world. May penetrating light dispel the darkness of ignorance. Let all karma be resolved and the mind flower bloom in eternal spring. May the Dharma body maintain strength and health, and years of life be lengthened for all teachers of this Sangha. May their vows be fully realized, and may they live in perfect peace with Buddha Dharma. We pray for those suffering from violence and those who grieve for them, for those living in oppression, for all who are imprisoned who should be free, for all refugees from violence, hunger, and catastrophe, man-made or natural. We pray for the health and well-being of those suffering from diseases of body, mind, or spirit, and those working toward the healing of those afflictions. We pray for those suffering from COVID-19, those trying to protect and treat them, and those grieving for those lost to this pandemic. May they be serene through all their troubles, and may we realize the enlightened way together. Thank you very much for coming. Hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and I will see you soon.